Our next category of psychotherapies are going to be humanistic psychotherapies. And as the title implies, we're going to be focusing on the human aspect. So if you remember back to the different perspectives on behavior, our humanistic approaches are mostly focusing on humans being sort of in control of their own behavior. So we're going to, in this instance, view humans as capable of controlling their actions, taking responsibility for their behavior, having that sort of personal owning of what they have done. And so within this category of psychotherapies, they believe that everyone has the internal resources available to them for self-healing and personal growth. So the idea that we should be able to help ourselves to heal and grow, and that we are sort of self-driven. And that our disordered behavior, the problems that bring us to therapy, it's coming from blocks to that natural ability or process. So this maladaptive behavior is a function of our distorted perceptions, our lack of awareness, or negative self-image. Now, this frame of mind, this sort of belief structure, is going to lead us into a very different treatment method than what we would have seen back in the psychodynamic therapies. So humanistic therapy is a lot more of a meeting of equals, where the client is on the same level as the therapist, whereas back in the psychodynamic therapies, we were looking at sort of the therapist being higher up or on a pedestal as compared to the client. But this equal environment this sort of equal meeting creates an environment that's going to foster an ability for self-exploration, where people feel comfortable exploring themselves. And it's going to give them a safe place to start unblocking those natural abilities to heal and grow. And by unblocking those blocked problems, they're going to lead to growth. Now, there is a little bit of overlap with our psychodynamic therapies because within this humanistic approach, we're seeing that barriers are often coming from childhood, which as soon as you see problems from childhood, you think Freud. But in this case, these experiences from childhood have usually created some kind of unrealistic or maladaptive standard for self-worth. So it's not that it's creating this repressed problem or deep-seated whatever we get from Freud and psychodynamic theories. In this case, it's all about how we start viewing our world and how we start viewing ourselves. So those childhood experiences and how we grow and shape as an individual is going to lead us to starting to feel empty or unfulfilled as we get older because we can't attain those inflated standards that we set for ourselves when we were younger. So here, our primary focus is going to be on the present and the future. So even though these problems started in the past, we're not as focused on the past as our psychodynamic theories are. We're going to be focused on what feelings we experience as they occur in order to try and handle them. So we're not focusing on the root of our childhood origins. We're accepting that some of our skewed perspectives on the world came from childhood, but what can we do with them now and into the future? So that's how we're comparing the two. So the first type of humanistic psychotherapy that we're going to talk about is client-centered therapy, which you'll sometimes see called person-centered therapy. And our key figure for this type of therapy is Carl Rogers. Now, I needed to stop right here because this is the photo that the textbook includes, and you've probably noticed I'm not a huge fan of including photos that don't really add anything, but this was possibly the creepiest photo that they could have chosen for this person, and it's printed in the textbook. So I just had to include it because I don't understand their choice here, and I think it's funny. But back to our client-centered therapy, the reason why you're actually here. So this type of therapy is probably the most well-known and widely used form of humanistic therapies. And like we said, this is coming from Rogers. And Rogers started in the sort of school of thought of that psychodynamic perspective, but wanted to start focusing on the active ingredient, as he called it, of the client-therapist relationship in therapy. So if you remember, our psychodynamic therapies had the therapist sort of sitting behind the client, and making decisions about the client or trying to lead the client to a particular conclusion. But Rogers wanted that more equal environment. So his focus was on the therapeutic environment itself, and he wanted to create an environment that would foster that self-exploration and personal growth that this humanistic psychotherapy idea is going to focus on. So what makes a good, positive interaction relationship between the client and the therapist? What is going to foster that positive environment? And so Rogers pointed to 3 important and interrelated attributes that would apply to the therapist that are essential in creating that ideal environment. So our 3 traits here are unconditional positive regard, empathy, and genuineness. So unconditional positive regard is basically the idea that the therapist is going to accept their clients without judgment or evaluation. That lack of judgment is going to make the clients feel comfortable opening up and talking about anything without fear of how they would be judged. For empathy, we want the therapist to be able to view the world through the client's eyes. So if you have empathy for someone, you understand where they're coming from. So if a therapist understands where a client is coming from, then they get that connection that not only are they not going to judge me, but they can sort of feel my point of view, they can empathize with me, they can understand why I feel the way that I do. And the last trait here is genuineness, which is a consistency between the therapist's beliefs and behaviors. But in practice, it means that they're not putting up a front. They're not pretending to empathize with you. They're not pretending to give you unconditional positive regard. They actually have that connection, and they're not pretending. So Rogers believed that if a therapist could have all 3 of these traits, then the clients are going to feel accepted, understood, and free to explore their basic attitudes and feelings without any fear of judgment or rejection. And there is quite a bit of research that actually supports this idea, where the therapist's qualities has a dramatic influence on the outcome of therapy. So having a supportive, empathetic, and genuine therapist can actually lead to more positive outcomes from your therapy sessions. Our next type of humanistic psychotherapy that we want to talk about very, very briefly is going to be Gestalt Therapy. Now, if you remember back to Psych 104, you might remember the term Gestalt when we were talking about perception. And here we're talking about Gestalt from its root word, basically meaning an organized whole. And so this type of therapy addresses the fact that usually we're only focusing on a very small part of our experience. And so specifically relating it to Gestalt stuff, maybe we focus on the figure and ignore the background. So we focus on the main event, but we ignore the other aspects of our life that contribute to that main event. So the goal of our Gestalt therapy is to try and bring feelings, wishes, and thoughts into awareness. So take all of those background aspects and bring them to the forefront. Make the client whole again by looking at the whole picture. So it's not just the current event, the current problem that you're facing. You also want to bring in the stuff that you're feeling and thinking about and hoping for in the background and bring it all together. So for methods, a lot of Gestalt therapy would be carried out in groups. Not always, but sometimes, where you can have discussions as a group. When we're carrying out Gestalt therapies, you'll notice very quickly that they're a lot more active and dynamic than the client-centered approaches that we just talked about. So our client-centered approaches usually involved a conversation between the therapist and the client where they would discuss the problem and what they should do. Our Gestalt therapies are going to be a little bit more involved than that, and a lot of times they're going to involve role play, where the client is asked to sort of put themselves into the shoes of someone else in that particular problem with them. So they'll use a specific technique, the empty chair technique, where they would have the client carry on a conversation with someone as though they were sitting in the empty chair, as they put it. So if you have a problem with your mother, then in therapy, you would have two chairs. The client sits in one, and in the first chair, they are themselves. But when they finish speaking, when they finish their part of the conversation, they would stand up and sit in the other chair. And when they're in that other chair, they respond as though they were their own mother. And so in this way, the client sort of has to take on both roles. They have to see the issue from both their own perspective and that of the other person in the issue. So in this case, the mother. And so by being forced to face both sides of that issue, we can start evoking very powerful feelings, and it can make clients aware of unresolved issues in the relationship, and issues in one relationship, because we're going back to that Gestalt idea. You can take issues from one relationship and apply it to others. So it's not just a problem here, maybe it's a problem in all relationships. Apply it to the bigger picture. So by role playing and by taking on different roles and having to face what's happening or what perspectives other people might have, people tend to find the root of their own problem.